Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for joining us here in the Frankfurt studio. My name is Carolyn. I'm the Vice President at Taylor & Francis for Europe, Middle East and Africa. So I work across our books, journals, but have a background in open research. And I'm joined by my colleague, Ellie Suster, who's the head of our Transformative Agreement Programme globally. And we're going to talk a little bit today about open research in the humanities. As one of the biggest humanities publishers, or the biggest humanities publishers in the world, this is obviously a topic that is very dear to our heart, that we're very focused on, interested in, and we want to share some of our perspectives here today. Have we got a clicker? Okay, I'll make a start anyway then. So we know that the policy landscape is evolving surrounding open research more broadly, particularly driven here in Europe. And we know that there are widely acknowledged challenges that this poses specifically for researchers in arts, humanities and social sciences, where perhaps funding and publication options are not keeping pace with the policy requirements of them. Things look very different in terms of their outputs, in terms of the funding structures, than for STEM researchers, which is largely where the open research movement was kind of born out of. Whilst funding is lower than in STEM, we also know that there's issues such as single authorship on papers, whereas in STEM we might have 40, 50, 100 authors, and that many more opportunities to attract funding to that piece of research. So for in the humanities, this is widely talked about, but we know there are other issues too. And this is a challenge that we're going to offer some insights from the publisher's perspective, but is very much one that needs to be addressed across all stakeholders. So one that we need to work with institutions, with funders, with societies. The lens that we're looking at this at Taylor & Francis is not just one of policy compliance, though. We very much want to focus on the impact that this can have. So if we think about the opportunities we have as a society for human progress globally, when we open up research and the benefits that we see, what would those opportunities look like if we were able to open up humanities, arts and social sciences research at scale in a way that hasn't really been able to be achieved to date? How do we measure this impact? And if we think about some of the examples that have come out of recent years through the COVID-19 pandemic, and there was a lot of talk about the sort of obvious benefits of opening up medical research, vaccine development, but then inevitably the social sciences research needed to roll out that vaccine. That's great. That's still an example that's kind of linked intrinsically to the benefits of STEM. And what we're actually seeing is some really nice examples coming out of social sciences and humanities research that's totally standalone from that. So for example, things like female participation in sport being driven and increased through research-based policy change on kit regulations. Oh, we have slides. I'll just move along. So this is something, as I said, that we're really excited to think about at Taylor & Francis. We're very much embracing, and we're very much looking to find ways and pathways to be able to fulfill the needs of those researchers. So we're going to start with a little bit of data to put this in context. It's a topic that's widely talked about, but I think it's always useful to see some numbers against it. So this is a study that was run by the Taylor & Francis Research and Data team. It's from 2019, so we might expect that some of those results may have changed slightly in the last few years, but as an indication, I think it's still really interesting to see that when researchers were asked globally, this is across all subject areas, would you submit your paper to a fully open access journal? It was actually 50% of HSS researchers that said they wouldn't. And only 16% saying they would, which in contrast to the STM responses, we can see that significant difference. When we dig into that a little bit more to find out the reasons behind that, a large part of it, as you might expect, is to do with funding. So funding as a barrier either for practical reasons, as in they don't have access to it, or for more kind of philosophical reasons that they just don't believe they should have to access that kind of funding to publish. I think what's interesting and surprised me is that it's still 30% of those authors that are saying that quality is an issue. So it's not just funding that we're talking about here as a perceived barrier. And actually, if we look at the the highest ranking, high impact factor journals in SSH subject areas. Generally, they are still hybrid models. There's very few that are operating on full OA. So I guess that, we might assume that there's a correlation there with those kind of attitudes, and that's something that we want to be able to change. This is from a different study that was run more recently, earlier this year in 2023. And what this does is break down not just by discipline, but also by career stage. So you can see the pale blue on the left-hand side there is early career researchers, the pink is mid, and then the darker blue is late career stage. Again, not hugely surprising trends there. We can see that across every question that was asked, the early career stage generally are more engaged with open access, more focused on thinking that should be the future of publishing. And this is the same across most of the sort of attitudes and beliefs towards open research. The place where we see it differ is the perception in the impact that has on tenure. And I think this is really interesting finding to come out of this. You can see it highlighted on the graph there, where actually in Humanities and Social Sciences, there's a perception that articles published open access are not going to have the same impact on their ability to seek tenure and promotion. Again, I think this makes the point that it's not just about funding models. We need to see this holistically. We need to think about how the reward structure is set up. What kind of metrics are we using to evaluate researchers, and how do they tie in with the sort of publication behaviors that we want to drive? This also mirrors what we hear from some of our societies. So there's a real distinction when we're talking to scholars in arts, humanities, and social sciences between the kind of philosophical ideas around open access and the belief that this is, should be the future. It will be the future. It's going to become the default. You can see that on the very first graph, where overwhelmingly almost 90% of early career researchers across every discipline felt that all research should be published open access in the future. But then the sort of practical application of that, how do we realize those kind of philosophical ambitions? So again, I think this is interesting data to sort of complement the barriers that we already know about in terms of funding. Is thinking about that sort of bigger picture that's going on for scholars in these areas. Similarly, if we think about awareness, these are some of the main initiatives that are out there, largely in Europe, some of the kind of policy drivers, some of the programs of work that are trying to foster open research and to accelerate it. And again, we can see there amongst our HSS respondents, 66% had no awareness of any of these, which is perhaps higher than I think I would even have expected. Okay, so what can we do about this? Fundamentally, I think the headline to all of this, for our belief, is that we need a diverse set of pathways to achieve an open research ambition in HSS. We've seen some fantastic results coming through from our transformative agreement program, where we've put agreements in place with libraries to convert research to open access at scale. And Ellie's going to talk a little bit more about that in this presentation. But that's kind of one route, and it's our firm belief that we need to provide a diverse set of pathways, differing timelines, differing geographies, specifically for these different subject areas. So I'm going to touch on a few of those now. Firstly, if we think about the business models, and I've mentioned multiple times about the lack of access potentially to APC funding, we know that author pay models do not work as effectively in these subject areas. So this is not something that's new. This sits alongside plenty of collective funding models that are already out there, Subscribe to Open, Knowledge Unlatched. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with these. And this is something that Taylor and Francis is very keen to explore and to engage in. So one step along this path was the launch of our Pledge to Open model earlier this year, which launched in July, which aims to open up 7 collections of open books that are linked to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So again, linking back to that idea of doing this for impact and thinking about the real world outcomes that we can expect to achieve through opening up research. So this is, as I said, early days. We've started to have partnerships signed with institutions from the US and interest in Europe. So we're really excited to see how this goes. You can see there the collections that have been set. And as I said, this is just one route and one kind of pilot way that we want to start looking at these, but amongst many others that we're looking at exploring. Aside from business models then, there's also the concept of what kind of stuff or outputs actually come out of an HSS research lifecycle. And this can look and feel very different to outputs from within STEM, which means that when we're applying things like an author sat in front of some data sharing guidelines, a university administrator sat evaluating a researcher's publication outputs, what do these outputs look like and how do they kind of fit into that system that's already set up? One of the most common things we hear from our HSS authors is, I don't have any data. And actually, when you start looking into that a bit more, you start exploring what research has been done. There's a rich array of data. It just doesn't look like numbers on a spreadsheet. It can be multimedia, images, photograph, music, all these kind of diverse outputs that have contributed to that piece of research. And actually, if they're made openly available, really enhance the visibility of that research, the reproducibility, all of the aims that we want to achieve through an open research transition. So article types and output types is something that we've started to set targets for our journals to adopt. So we're looking at expanding the number of journals which can offer things like method articles, registered reports, data notes. And we're seeing a really good take-up of these, particularly in fields such as geography, education, psychology, areas that perhaps we haven't seen so much adoption of these in the past. Similarly, we're also looking at tools that can help to do this. So integrations with things such as Sketchfab. I don't know if any of you will be aware of this, that can be embedded into a journal platform and will allow for things like 3D modeling. So for example, in our archaeology research, we can have the 3D modeling that was used in that piece of research available as part of the article on the platform. Then if we think about data sharing guidelines, and I mentioned how, a lot of these are really set up for STEM authors, and we hear a lot about, putting data in gem banks and things like that. But actually, there's real opportunity here for HSS authors to make data availability statements, to make it more transparent of what kind of data has underpinned this research. And this is completely free for them to do. This is not something that requires funding. It just requires a slightly different way of presenting those guidelines and that support to authors. So there's a couple of examples here. It's possibly too small for you to read on the slides. But this is a case where we've had an example of researchers actually going into physical archives. And if you as the reader want to explore this, you want to reproduce some of this research, you would have to make an appointment with that office in Glasgow and go and knock on the door and you can see it. But just by adding that data availability statement just makes that more accessible, gives it more visibility as to how that was conducted and what underpinned it. Similarly, with things like survey results, with poetry, all of these kind of availability statements really help to make that sort of transparency come through in a way that we haven't seen a great take-up of in the past. So another example of where we're really trying to offer support and focus in on this, this is a platform that's been built on the F1000 model. So it's a fully open research publishing platform with pre-publication transparent peer review. And this platform is run by Routledge, obviously a strong brand in arts, humanities and social sciences, and was actually the first place that data sharing guidelines were developed specifically for HSS researchers. We worked with scholars in the field to make sure that this would fit. And again, it's relatively early days for this to have sort of concrete results. One of the early metrics we've been looking at to assess how well this is working in terms of authors getting their papers through and data sharing policies not being a barrier to that publication is looking at how long those papers sit in the editorial processes. And we know that in the past, when these kind of policies around open data have been a barrier to authors, those papers tend to sit there a lot longer than their STEM counterparts because there's that much more back and forth with the editors to try and figure out how to make this work. That's not something we've seen at all on this platform. So it's pretty clear evidence that it sounds really obvious, but we make that sort of tailored to this research group. We make it clear about what we mean by data, where and how that can be linked and shared. And actually, we're seeing the results already of those papers flowing through. We're seeing a similar kind of impact on the Open Research Europe platform, which is also an F1000 model. So we know that about 5 to 10% of the Horizon grants are awarded to humanities research, but we're seeing about 10% of the publications on that platform in humanities. And if we include social sciences, that increases to 41%. So really kind of punching above its weight in terms of the publication uptake that we're seeing. Again, I think it shows that if we put those options and those publication opportunities there, we've got the funding mechanisms in place, the appetite is there. It's just a case of, making this as smooth as possible and as bespoke as possible for these type of outputs. Another element of the F1000 model is the ability to publish those different output types. And again, that's something we're really seeing on these platforms, is where essays, case studies, policy briefs are being published around kind of 50-50 split between research articles and what we might think of as other. So again, real demand and uptake for getting those out and published when the opportunity is there for those researchers. So I'm going to stop there with the sort of output types, data sharing, and the different platform opportunities that we're looking at. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Ellie to talk a little bit more about the impact we're seeing through our transformative agreements.
Thanks, Carolyn. So Carolyn has spoken for the last few minutes around the range of models that we believe are needed to support researchers in those HSS disciplines to publish openly. And at TNF, we are seeing transformative agreements as one route to opening up HSS OA publishing. And as many of you will be familiar with, these agreements are put in place centrally, most often with the library, to centralise open access funding and mean that authors at those institutions can publish open access at no cost to themselves without having to pay the APC, as it's covered by the agreement. So, as I said, we are seeing TAs as one route to rapidly accelerating OA. And because of our journal portfolio with around 1,500 HSS journals, this is having particular impact for those HSS communities. So we have now around 30 transformative agreements in 20 countries. And between 2018 and 2022, over 70% of the content that was made OA under one of these agreements fell into an HSS discipline, an HSS subject area. And that's compared to about 16% S&T, science and technology, and about 12% medical. And last year, I was also here at Frankfurt presenting on our transformative agreements. And I said that 69% at that point of the articles made OA under our agreements were in HSS. So we've continued to see that percentage increase, which suggests continued author engagement and adoption for open access when there is the funding put in place. And I think it's also important to think about awareness, which is a really, really important part of making these agreements work in practice for all subject communities, of course, for HSS subject communities as well. Workflows, author marketing, making sure the authors are aware of the agreement at the important point in which they have to opt and say yes to OA. It's all part and parcel of making sure that these agreements work in practice and we can see the benefits that we want to see for all subject communities. So what's the impact and why is this important? And I think at TNF, we are looking at impact in the broadest possible sense. So what's the outcome on society? How are these agreements, once the articles are made open access, how is it helping to improve outcomes and people's lives? So I think it's important to address what we mean by impact. And of course, it will mean different things to different researchers at different stages of their careers and in different subject communities. And so it's important to note there are different ways in which we can look at it. But if we look at impact for a particular research community, for HSS, as I said, we have seen a significant increase in OA publications. And in fact, our HSS publishing director has said that transformative agreements are a bit of a game changer for HSS subject communities. And if we didn't have those agreements in place that we have now, we would be going back to sort of 2018 levels of paywall content. So you can really see the impact that that's having at individual journal level as well. And then looking at impact within academia, and we can see that these agreements lead to an increase in citations. So if we look at a subset of our agreements and their publishing output in 2017 in hybrid journals, and that was before their agreements had begun, and compare that to 2022 when those same group of institutions were publishing predominantly open access because of the agreements in place, we can see an in-year citation advantage. So the total number of in-year citations for the 2022 articles that were analysed was around 1.5 times greater compared to the 2017 set. And that's despite around the same number of articles being tracked there. So a clear benefit there in terms of citations. And then thirdly, and really importantly, impact beyond academia. So how are these agreements having impact and outcomes for society as a whole? So one way that we can look at this and analyse this is influence on global policy. So we can see that articles made open access under our agreements. We've seen articles referenced in policy documents, including the Publications Office of the European Union, the OECD, and UNESCO. So really linking back to that real world impact and the outcome on society when we can see these articles referenced in important policy documents. So we've talked about it on a broader level, but I think it's interesting to look at it in a more specific way, looking at a particular agreement. And earlier this year, we released a white paper that analysed our first 2 years of our transformative agreement with the Jisc consortium in the UK. So that's about 130 institutions that are part of that agreement, over 10,000 articles made open access under that agreement. And so we took the time to put a white paper together to really analyse what that agreement has achieved. So how has this partnership boosted open access in humanities and social sciences? So a significant number of articles were published by HSS authors under the agreement. And it's interesting to look at really specific subject areas. So there were over 250 open access articles in TNF history journals, for example. And the proportion of OA history articles with an author at a participating UK institution under this agreement rose from just 10% in 2020 to 74%, nearly 3/4 last year. And actually around 80% of all articles published open access under that agreement in 2021 and 2022 were in HSS. So even a greater percentage than the overall numbers that I shared just now. And secondly, looking at citations in policy documents. So according to the Overton database, almost 499 articles published OA via the agreement in 2021 and 2022 had been cited in policy documents by governments such as the UK government, the New Zealand Ministry of Health, intergovernmental organisations like the UN, the World Health Organization, for example, and think tanks and repositories like the Institute of Development Studies in the UK. And actually 4 out of 5 of the top cited journals in policy documents are actually in HSS. So really highlighting the importance of the real world applicability of HSS subject areas in solving real world problems. And thirdly, growth in citations and downloads and mentions in news and blogs. So according to Altmetric Explorer, the number of mentions of UK TNF research in news and blogs between 2020 and 2021 rose from about 1,900 to more than 2,300. And actually, by the end of 2022, the articles had been mentioned in over 4,000 news stories in around 70 countries. So really having the global reach and impact and engagement with as the articles are open. And I think it's interesting and important to look at the high level metrics and to be able to see what's happening at scale. But we can't lose sight of the individual authors who are publishing under this agreement and for whom impact means something very specific to them, as I mentioned earlier. And I think a really nice example is one of the articles that was published earlier this year under the Jisc agreement. And it's to do with gendered sportswear. So it was published OA in March or April, I think. And by an author called Tess Howard, who was at Durham at the time. And the research found that gendered sports kits, such as skirts, play a major role in teenage girls dropping out of sport. And within 3 weeks of publication, the article had been picked up by 17 news outlets, including BBC News and The Guardian in the UK. And actually, I checked just before this presentation and it's increased to over 25 now. So continuing to have the impact even a few months after publication. And so her research is really broadening out beyond academia. And it's actually already had impact in terms of impacting policy. So there's already been changes to domestic sports kits regulation in the UK. Tess has now set up her own non-profit company, Inclusive Sportswear, really looking at how she can build on this research to impact real people's lives and continue what she found in her research. And actually, when we spoke to Tess a couple of months ago, she said that she really benefited from the agreement. She wouldn't have been able to go away were it not for this agreement. So really showing how this is having impact for individual researchers as well. So just to sum up, I'm conscious of the time now. I think to achieve a transition to OA, as we've said, stakeholders across the publishing ecosystem really need to work together on a diversity of models and outputs to make sure that we can continue the transition. And the diversity of approaches is really important, and that ranges from article types and data sharing, as Carolyn spoke about, to publication models and venues. And as I've just said, TAs, transformative agreements, are one mechanism to really accelerate OA in all disciplines, but in particular in HSS that we've found and that we've shared. I'm conscious of the time, so if you do have questions, Carolyn and I will be at the TNF stand for the rest of the day if anyone had any questions or wanted to discuss further. But just thank you very much to everybody.